Welcome to the Financial Flossing Podcast with Ross Brannan, guiding dental professionals to a brighter future. Ross Brannan is a financial advisor who knows it's not just about your teeth. He helps dental practice owners protect and maximize today's cash flow to plan for tomorrow's cash needs. Find him at rossbrannan.com. On the show, he brings together experts to help dental professionals looking to make smart money decisions to grow their income, turn their retirement goals into reality, and improve their lives. And now, here's your host, Ross Brannan.
Welcome to the show. My guest today is Dr. Richard Hewitt of Beachside Dental Consultants. Richard started in his hometown of Maine 32 years ago. He built a practice from scratch where he averaged 50 new patients a month. After 9 years, he sold it and moved to Florida. Smart man right there. And where he successfully bought and merged 4 existing practices into one. He produced in the top 20% nationwide on a 150-day work year. And so Richard has a lot of really cool things to talk about, a lot of wisdom to share. Richard, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure being with you. Thank you for having me on.
Sure thing. So out of school, you went to the military, and then you started practicing in Maine. So kind of walk us through your story.
I'd like to add in there that, between my junior and senior years that summer, the prime interest rate, New York prime, was 18.3%. So when we talk about inflation today, I lived it. I looked at that interest rate and said, I better start looking at alternatives for when I get out of dental school.
Smart man. It's funny, we're panicking over a 4% interest rate on the Fed funds rate right now. It's exactly. Like we had free money for a decade, and all of a sudden now it costs something. We're panicking. But anyway, so you started in Maine, and you built a practice for 9 years. You sold it. Walk us through that story.
So basically, I also bought some practices in Maine too, but I started from scratch. And, I always tell people, don't be too impressed by the 50 new patients a month. I was the new person in town, so I pretty much got everybody else's, maybe possibly rejected patients, if you will. It did a lot of emergencies, but I noticed everybody took Wednesdays off. So I said, well, it looks like I'll be working Wednesdays. Maybe I'll just take Friday afternoon off. So that was like by luck. That was like one of my first good business moves because I was usually busy on Wednesday and saw a lot of emergencies and picked up some great patients on those days.
So after 9 years, you said, I'm tired of snow. I want to move to the sun. And you moved to Vero Beach, Florida. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So I had a conversation with my accountant, and he says, you realize that you're spending $6,000 to $8,000 a year on continuing education, and they're mostly courses in Florida. Did you ever think about maybe it'd be a little cheaper to take those courses if you live there? So I took him up on it.
Smart man. And you saved some tax money too.
Absolutely.
So now talk about, you're starting from scratch again, basically, to a degree. So what was that process like, kind of moving across the country and starting over?
Well, outside of the fact that at that time I had to, actually literally sit for a new exam in Florida, a couple of years before that. So I always tell people, you got to plan ahead for this. That was a 4-year window. I actually sat down and took the licensing boards, and it's totally different today. So what I'm saying right now is not relevant to the new dentist. But basically, I had about a 4-year window where, my wife and I said, okay, we're going to sell the practice. We're going to sell the house. We're going to get you a job transfer. So whenever you're talking about that kind of process, moving from state to state, you're looking at about a 4 to 5 year window, which is exactly what we did. And I had an associate at the time, and we engaged in a contract easily a year out before I moved. And it was a very smooth transition. He was a good dentist. And Jim kept most of my patients. After the fact, I did some, I went back and talked to him, and I would say he retained over 90% of my patient base up there. So it was a win-win for both.
Oh, that's great. So you end up coming down and you bought and merged 4 practices. That sounds really impressive. Talk about that.
Well, one thing that I'd like to tell all the young dentists out there is I wouldn't recommend a scratch practice for anyone unless there was literally not a dentist in that town. or the numbers just made sense. When I came down to Florida, I worked with a practice broker and did the transition, and I bought an existing practice and improved on that.
Well, let's stop right there, because you're saying don't start from scratch, because you're going to spend a bunch of money on build out, on equipment, on all that stuff. And that same amount of money you could use to buy an existing practice where you already have a patient list, whether they're good or bad or whatever. You're spending money either way. It's a better use of money to buy a practice. Is that what you're saying?
You're absolutely right, Ross. It's all about cash flow at the beginning. When you have an existing practice, you've got a stream of cash coming in. And you made a good point there about, regardless about the types of patients and stuff. And I always tell people, don't fret about the equipment, what it looks like, et cetera, et cetera. All those things can be improved and changed over time. Your goal is to get in there, establish a practice, retain the cash flow, retain the patients, and generate new patients from those patients.
Makes sense. So you went in there, you bought a practice. Where the other 3 practices come into play?
Okay, so the next one was an easy one, and it sort of kind of fell in my lap. He was a general dentist, very close nearby, and he was going back to endo school, and he was selling his practice. We absorbed his patients. We took him into our practice, and more importantly, we retained his staff, including a great hygienist and a good chairside person. And that doctor worked with me for about 3 or 4 months before he went off to do his endodontic program. So the patient, there again, when you have a transition like that, the patients tend to stay with the practice when they ease in like that. They came and they were seeing him at the end. He finished off his big cases, and it was a nice, smooth, easy transition.
All right, so now you have 2.
Right.
What did 3 and 4 look like?
So 3 is a simple one. The doctor just wanted to move to the west coast of Florida. And, you know Florida as well as I do. Some people get tired of seeing sunrises, so now they want to see sunsets. He moves over to the west coast, and he had a smaller practice. But, again, he worked for me for about 4 or 5 months. And dentists are pretty funny when they sell their practices and somebody takes over the management of it. Somehow they get really productive. And it was great for me, because it was basically, he was occupying my empty chairs and bringing in patients. And obviously I was paying him a salary, but I was getting the benefits from that increased cash flow. The 4th and final was a good one, was a class of 1951 Northwestern Dental School grad. And he was just at the tender age of 70, decided he was going to hang it up. And he was thrilled, A, that he was selling it to somebody with prior military experience, and B, somebody that actually went to his dental school. He was a great dentist, had a pretty decent recall, for somebody in that age bracket. And again, we got some staff members, and his patients were marvelous. I mean, really well-educated, well used to comprehensive dentistry. And that was like gravy off the top. I really enjoyed working with him. And he only practiced with me for 2 months.
And so you had 4 practices, you rolled into 1. Now, did you have 1 location? Did you have 2 locations? Did you have 4 locations? What'd you have?
I always kept 1 location. It's getting to be a little difficult juggling it. But if you do have distance problems, I recommend that, you would probably have more than 1 location. The last practice, the gentleman was on the Beachside of Vero Beach. So I actually physically moved the practice. I needed a new space. I expanded it. And that actually helped, because some of his older patients really didn't want to go too far, which is another factor when you're buying practices. Where are your patients coming from? You need to do zip code searches, et cetera, to figure out where these people are coming from.
So you produced in the top 20% nationwide on a 150-day work year. Now, 4 days a week, 150 days is 37 and a half weeks. So that's basically 15 weeks off, which is basically almost 4 months off a year. A lot of people are probably envious of hearing that. Talk about how you were able to do that.
Well, it's kind of funny. I really hear from a lot of young dentists And I'm sure you've heard this too about this work-life balance that they all want. Well, I got to tell you,
make enough money where you can do what you want, then you can have work-life balance.
Isn't it amazing how that works? Isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. It's like, when you're in private practice and whether you're solo or group and you've got that kind of control over your schedule, that's a work-life balance. And, the way you have to do that is when you're in the office, you are running like a banshee. I mean, you're in there to produce and you're not there to chit chat. And then the other time you're concentrating on running the practice business-wise, but you're doing it off chair, as I would call it. And you're strategizing and you're planning forward. And obviously one of the reasons I was taking time off too is I was in the Air Force Reserves and I was involved with the Dental Association. But I found that with that kind of schedule, I was never booked out more than a week in advance. And to tell you the truth, that's where I liked practicing, about a week in advance, tops.
All right. So eventually you sold your practice 2008 and you started consulting. You were consulting before that, but you really didn't have time to do both. You said, okay, at this point in my life, I'm going to start consulting. So talk a little bit about what your consulting business is like, what you focus on, how do you help people?
So a lot of the first initial consulting wasn't actually on site, at people's offices. It was mostly, a lot of it was transition. And to tell you the truth, I was helping fellow dentists that were in the military transition from, military life to practice life. Now that financially for me, that was more of almost a gift to colleagues of mine, but I got pretty good at it, really helping people out. I've got a long list of people I've helped over the years, and some of them have paid me back in more than just money. I did it that way. But then as my reputation got going, I started doing in-house advising, or with the wonders of Zoom, I can now do that now. And I had already gone through the financial planning courses that gave me some sort of, because invariably what happens is most people, once you get them going, dentists are smart people. They figure it out after a while. Sometimes they just need a push in the right direction. But then what I used to tell them is like, okay, you've got the operations figured out. What are you going to do with the financial part? And that's where I worked with their partners. If they already had CPAs or CFPs, I would, say, hey, I'll work with any of your people. I'll work with your estate attorney. I'll work with any of it, because I had the financial language behind me and the knowledge, but I felt, well, they need somebody probably, especially if I'm dealing with people away from me, that says, maybe they need to be handed off to their local advisors who probably were giving good advice to begin with.
So what are the challenges that you see dentists facing today? There's a lot of stuff going on in the world. What are the biggest challenges you're seeing?
I think the biggest challenges is I always tell people, buying a practice or setting up solo or, just doing private practice as a whole today is sort of like trying to eat an elephant. How do you eat an elephant? You do it one bite at a time. And I think it's overwhelming for a lot of young dentists. Now, a lot of them according to the ADA statistics, probably about 30% of our dentists coming out of dental schools will try the DSO route or try associateships, because they really literally need to get their feet wet. And once they do that, they still realize, a lot of dentists are entrepreneurial in spirit, and they still realize, hey, I want to be doing this, on my own or with a group of like-minded individuals. And there's plenty of room in dentistry right now, even though there's a lot of consolidation. I'd still say that, the opportunities are still there. You just have to look a little harder.
Well, you brought up the DSO world, and that's obviously kind of a polarizing topic. Do you have any opinions on selling to a DSO versus not selling to a DSO and all that?
So I've worked for a DSO, and that was in the 2012 time, because I was actually helping a friend. He's the one that sold to the DSO, and they convinced him that, he should bring me on part-time just to help him out, because their model existed, that what existed was a two-person model. And I found out, and I learned a lot from what they were doing. The selling process is pretty interesting, because they go with the EBITDA formula, which is earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation. And they initially may offer you more money than you could get for a private sale.
Well, but they beat you down. They're going to offer you X, but by the time it's all over, it's 70% of X.
You're right on the money. 70 to 80% is the formulas that I've seen. And basically what you're doing is you're earning your own 20% because they now set new production goals, which are significantly higher than what you produced at. And it goes counter to what you're doing, to what, like I did in 2008. I was already working 150 days. So if I sold to a DSO at that time, the only thing they would have wanted me to do is work more days. That's not what I wanted to do. Right. So it's for everybody.
Right. So if you were selling today, would you sell to a DSO where you're likely going to get more, or would you sell to maybe call it pay it forward and sell to an associate, or would you sell to someone moving to the area? What would you do?
I think the best advice I can give somebody at this point in time is I would, certainly run the numbers with your financial people. Have them take a look at them. And if your goals are more important, what's your time frame? We just talked earlier in the show about a 4-year time frame before you do any of this. What are you doing in those 4 years? How are you setting up your practice? So you may or may not be able to get as many people interested in buying your practice, but there are enough dentists out there that are looking for opportunities. And you may consider, instead of a DSO, selling to a group of large, a bunch of dentists that are looking to gather extra practices.
Well, that's one thing you're seeing. You're seeing dentists kind of creating many DSOs in scenarios. Yeah, I've talked to dentists who sold to a DSO at, say, 46, 47 years old. And I said, what are you going to do with your life now? Because retirement is kind of a myth for those who don't know. And he says, I'm going to manage my investments. And I looked at him and I said, you ain't that rich.
Yeah, I mean, I find that interesting that somebody would think that that's a 40-hour-a-week job, considering you know what it takes to manage your clients and how much time it takes you per client.
Right. And
since we both live in Florida, that life on the golf course 7 days a week isn't exactly desirable for a lot of people either.
No, that's a recipe to die early. So how are you coaching your clients through this challenging employment situation of attracting and retaining staff? What's the solution? Is there one there?
Well, you brought up a really good point because the workforce issues are nationwide. Everybody is looking for employees. There are a lot more temp agencies now that help out, so you can tap those. And I have a list of those that I provide my clients with that are reputable. The days of putting it out on, even putting it out like in Glassdoor and Indeed and places like that, you're probably not going to get that many bites. Everybody has the shortages. There's some areas of the country that are more short than others. Obviously, in Florida, we have the luxury of people streaming into our state. I mean, they may be temporarily streaming out on the West Coast right now, but they're all coming back. And so some states, it's going to be easier to find people than in other states. Merging practices, like I said, you pick up people. And the other thing is offer a good pay package. You got to look at benefits. You got to look at stuff like that. And that's where financial planning comes into play.
No, I've talked with clients who basically are going to have to start offering benefits and increasing pay to stay competitive. And they're reluctant to do it, but they know they have to because it's going to, and that's just the reality. So when you bring a new client on to your consulting practice, what's the first thing that you look at?
I don't look at any numbers per se on the first pass. I like to know where they're at, what their goals are looking out for 5 years, and what do they envision themselves doing in dentistry. And you get a tremendous, as you know, you have clients like this, you get a tremendous amount of answers, as far as the variety. And some people will tell you, Rick, I just want to bury my head in dentistry. I want to do that. And I want to come home and I don't want to think about dentistry until Monday. And I usually tell those people, nice to have, but work-life balance usually doesn't work that way. you have to stay engaged.
What's the number one advice or what's the advice that you give most commonly? Like if you see 10 clients, you're giving the same advice, at least on this one thing, to 7 out of 10. What is it?
What's your retirement plan as far as like, what are you saving? What kind of vehicles are you using? What's your, are you inheriting a ton of money in 10 years? I have to know a little bit. You have to pry a little bit in terms of what's going on in the rest of their life, because is your partner working full-time for the rest of their life? And then there's children involved. You have to you try not to pry in terms of personal information. But as you know, some of that information is very important if you're going to give the right financial advice.
Oh, absolutely. And the reality is some people haven't done a good job saving, so they have to sell to a DSO. Some people have done a good job saving and they want to pay it forward to an associate. And so that changes everything. You ideally don't want to have all of your wealth wrapped up in your practice, but sometimes that happens. So as we kind of wrap up here and come to a close, what kind of parting advice would you give to somebody who's listening here today, whether they're 50 years old or whether they're 30 years old just starting out, or where maybe they're in dental school? What would you say?
Well, I guess since I experienced this inflation back in the early in my career, I'd say we'll get through this. We're going to get there will be some rough times in the economy. Dentistry tends to lag a little bit when the economy comes back. Right now, it's going pretty good because there's such a backlog due to COVID. However, that quickly may stop. Dentistry is, for the most part, discretionary income when it comes to people spending it. And if they don't have insurance coverage, a lot of them will forego it. So I would say stay on your plan. Make sure you save anywhere from 10 to 15% of your personal money and keep going. Don't be afraid of the stock market. You should be, as a 30-year-old, I'd say your exposure to equity should probably be in a 90% range. And just don't look backwards. It will come around. And I think you stay on a path, but you got to get good financial advice. And I'm really happy to be a guest on this program because you've got the right idea. It is a flossing philosophy when it comes to financial advice.
It's a pun, but it's true. So, Richard, if people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Well, there's two ways. They can look at my website if they want to see what kind of services I offer, and that's militarydentist.com. The basic email that I use is Dr. Hewitt at bellsouth.net.
Spell that.
Yeah, it's DRHUOT at bellsouth, all one word, .net. And that'll get you through. And there's also an email link on the website that they can use.
Well, Richard, I really appreciate you coming on the show. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Well, thank you, Russ. I've really enjoyed this episode. It was great.
You've been listening to the Financial Flossing Podcast with Ross Brannan.
This has been another episode of Financial Flossing with Ross Brannan, guiding dental professionals to a brighter future. If you liked what you heard, consider subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. For more on Ross Brannan, visit rossbrannan.com.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. Guest speakers and their firms are not affiliated with or endorsed by PAS, Guardian, or North Florida Financial, and opinions stated are their own. External sites and materials are provided for your convenience in locating related information and services. Guardian, its subsidiaries, agents, and employees expressly disclaim any responsibility for and do not maintain, control, recommend, or endorse third-party sites, organizations, products, services, and make no representation as to the completeness, suitability, or quality thereof. Ross is a registered representative and financial advisor of Park Avenue Securities, LLC, PAS, OSJ, 3664 Coolidge Court, Tallahassee, Florida, 32311, 850-562-9075. Security products and advisory services offered through PAS, member FINRA, SIPC, financial representative of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, New York, New York. PAS is the wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. North Florida Financial is not an affiliate or subsidiary of PAS or Guardian. Arkansas Insurance License 1613-9032. California Insurance License 0L10073. 2022-144712 expires 1024.